So welcome to our week on macro level opinion. For today, we're going to rehash what micro level opinion is, then shift over into what macro level opinion is. We'll follow up with some examples of macro level opinion, including a discussion of aggregated ideology, partisanship, and presidential approval, and finally a discussion of policy mood. Be aware, though, that that your chapter discussed not just these measures, but also aggregated policy opinions as well and policy preferences. So just a reminder, micro level opinion focuses on the individual level opinion and how opinions are formed at the individual level. Again, as we discussed last week, opinions at the individual level can be quite erratic and change quite a bit from day to day and month to month. In other words, they're not always that stable. By contrast, macro level opinion aggregates or adds up all those individual level survey responses. These aggregated survey responses give us a sense of how people, broadly defined, feel about issues and really just what the public mood is. The nice thing about macro level opinion is that it's really far more stable than micro level opinion. We call this the miracle of aggregation, which your textbook briefly touches on. A lot of the errors, this just means that a lot of the errors and fluctuations that we get in interviewing individuals cancels out when we aggregate or add all the responses together. Now, let's look at a few examples of macro level opinion. Here we can see ideology over time. This is our first example of macro level opinion. And there are three options: conservative, moderate, and liberal. Moderate tends to be more popular, followed closely by conservative and then liberal. And these have been fairly stable over time, with about 40% reporting moderate, 30 to 35% reporting conservative, and 20 to 25% reporting liberal. Here's a slightly different wording of the question with a few more options. Respondents can answer very conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal, as opposed to the last question where there were only three options. Here we can see identifying as conservative or moderate are the most popular choices in recent years. See how this is from 1992 to 2020. But for both conservative and moderate, about 35% identify with either group, and about 25% of people identify as liberal. Identifying as liberal is relatively unpopular to identifying as conservative or moderate, but still has become slightly more popular over time. So since 1992, it's gone up from 17 to about 25. Despite most people wanting to identify as conservative between the two options, conservative and liberal, because conservatism is a really popular ideology, most people in the US, in fact, have really liberal policy preferences. This is actually the subject of an entire book by Ellison Stemson. The book is called Ideology in America, and the idea behind that book is that people identify themselves as conservatives, but in fact have liberal policy preferences, and it sort of delves into that. Our next example of macro level opinion is party identification, and it's similar. Yes, there have been changes over time, but they're still sort of largely stable, and the changes have occurred pretty slowly, with small shifts from year to year. Currently, about a third of people identify as Democrats, and this is a decline from what it was at mid-century. More and more people have identified themselves as independents, with about a third of people identifying as such. And about 25 to 30% of people identify as Republicans. Here's a more recent figure to show you how people have identified in the past 10, 20 years. Now, this doesn't include moderates, so keep this in mind that it doesn't directly compare to this last picture. But this one here demonstrates that identifying as a Democrat is slightly more likely than identifying as a Republican, with there being about a 5 percentage point difference between those who identify as a Democrat, the blue, and those who identify as a Republican, the red. And this has been relatively stable over the past decade or so. Our third example of macro level opinion is presidential approval. Here we're looking at presidential approval for all presidents since JFK, including JFK too. As we can see here, approval tends to decline over the course of their presidency. So here's Johnson declining, Nixon for obvious reasons, first Bush, which is here, declining, second Bush, again declining, and Obama declining. There are a few exceptions like Clinton. See how it has a good uptick over the course of time, but he also benefited from a strong economy in his second term. I'll also note, it doesn't really show here, but Trump's approval ratings stayed largely stable over the course of his term, which sort of bucked the trend of declining approval ratings. And there are obviously partisan differences in presidential approval as well, particularly in the past 30 years as polarization in the electorate has set in. So here is with Eisenhower is our first one. With Eisenhower, Democrats have lower approval ratings than Republicans because Eisenhower was a Republican, but there's not as big of a difference here as there is, say, here. Look, for instance, along the bottom of this chart. See how it says 49, 49, 40, 34, 36. This is the approval rating among other people who identify from the other party. So this is the approval rating of Democrats, of Eisenhower. This is the approval ratings of Republicans. This is of Obama, right? And so at mid-century, these are really like in the 50s, or in the 40s. And then looking at Obama, they're now in the teens. Republicans had an average approval rating in the teens. This is quite normal now for the opposing party to really disapprove of the president just because of polarization in the electorate. And our last example of macro level opinion is policy mood. So what is it? So this piece you read from Jim Stinson, and the policy mood is the latent attitude structures underlying aggregate preferences. So how liberal or conservative policy preferences are in the aggregate. How does Jim Stinson do this? First, he collects a lot of surveys that ask questions about policy preferences. The question must be asked across multiple years, at least 2 years. He recodes those variables into having a liberal or conservative direction. And then for each question, he codes it as percent of people who answered the question as liberal divided by the percent of people who answered liberally plus the percent of people who answered conservatively. And then finally, he uses factor analysis on all of these questions together, which is really a fancy method to see how all these different questions move together and are associated with each other and how they change over time. And then he drops any questions that don't fit super well. Okay? So some questions that go into the policy mood include the following. Are you in favor of the death penalty for persons convicted of murder? Do you consider the amount of federal income tax which you have to pay is too high, about right, or too low? In general, do you approve or disapprove of labor unions? The government ought to help people get doctors and hospital care at low cost. Do you favor or oppose gun control laws? Are we spending too much, too little, or about right on welfare? And then he codes the responses as being liberal or conservative. Be aware, yes, I have listed 6 questions here. This is not an exhaustive list of all the questions that go into the policy mood. It is a lot more. This is just a few. So here we're looking at the policy mood over time. Just look at this solid line though, okay? Just look at the solid line. Don't look at the dashed one. The higher this solid line is, the more liberal the policy mood. So in 2018, the policy mood is really at its highest point in the past 70 years since they began measuring it in 1952. It's fairly liberal from the mid-1950s, right? We see the policy mood is pretty liberal right here. It's again a little liberal in the mid-1980s through the mid-1990s. And again, we see a general rise in the aughts, a little bit of a decline, and then it rises back again. We'll discuss a bit more what drives these changes in the policy mood in discussion section though. So what we covered today was micro-level opinion and how that contributes to macro-level opinion. We also talked about aggregated ideology, partisanship, presidential approval, and the policy mood. But I will see you all in discussion section where we'll talk about these a bit more.